welcome everybody to
Yeah,
the second issue or edition of our podcast, Fierce Grace. We should probably explain what we mean by the term Fierce
yeah, yeah,
Grace.
yeah, yeah. Explain it, Steve.
Oh, I thought you were going to explain it. No,
Well,
I'm joking.
sort of you can do it this time.
I'll start. Well,
Yeah,
to me, there is often an association, a kind of a myth that spiritual people are quite passive and maybe indifferent to the world. Everything is really perfect, so we don't need to worry about anything. We don't really need to interfere with world events because everything is basically perfect. And if you can't sense the perfection, if you can only see the suffering and discord, maybe there's something wrong with you. But I don't think that's the case. I think if you are truly spiritually awakened, you feel a very strong impulse to, or a sense of mission to help others and to make the world a better place, to alleviate some of the suffering in the world, to bring harmony into the discord of the world. So I think that's what fierce grace is. It's the endeavor that comes from that is basically a deep spiritual impulse to bring harmony into the world, to alleviate the suffering, and actually to enact change in the world, positive change.
yeah, absolutely, Steve. And also, I don't think we have to be spiritually awakened in order to do that, because if we had to wait till we were spiritually awakened before we did anything, none of us would ever be able to do anything. So I think that, um,
But
and so yeah, but I just want to make the sort of point is that there's a grace in painful and difficult things happening. That's the point. That we think difficult things and painful things and suffering things is not grace, it's bad. I mean, if we were spiritual, we shouldn't have these things happening. But actually, it's in our dealing with life's difficulties, in our enduring the suffering that we have. Our partner dies, we have a serious disease, in sort of taking these feelings into our heart and working with them, we sort of grow as a
yeah.
human being. And therefore, the grace element is that what seemed to be the opponent is actually the friend. So the opponent, the thing that opposes you, is actually the friend helping you. And I think that that's an important part, don't you think, Steve?
Definitely, yeah. Maybe that's another myth about spirituality, that to be spiritual means that life becomes incredibly stable and peaceful and easy and blissful. But actually, as you say, it is when life is challenging, it's when crises arise in our lives that we grow the most. And I mean, I have this concept which has really emerged from my research, which is called transformation through turmoil. And that shows that a lot of people do experience a spiritual awakening in the midst of trauma and turmoil, which it could be a diagnosis of cancer. It could be a bereavement, as you say. It could be a long period of depression or a long period of addiction. And it's often when we get to the lowest point, when we think that we've lost everything, that's when we undergo the greatest, the deepest transformation. And I've met hundreds of people who've undergone that transformation.
Yeah, I mean, I worked at a rehab center for a few years, and it was really interesting seeing how people were in denial, but when they reached rock bottom, when when their life stopped working, they couldn't hold the job, their wife sort of left them, and they suddenly lost. Somehow they were a space to let in the help of
Yeah.
the universe. Because I would also like to say that I feel we live in a universe where we have an availability to be helped, that the universe is a helping universe. It,
Mm.
it kind of helps us in our journeys. And so if we meditate and we tune in and we try to help others, the universe will help us as well. But
Mm.
we need to be tuned into the universe. And sometimes the universe thinks, yes, that person has so much ego that they're not listening to anything else. And so we'll have to give them a crisis in order to take their ego away, and then the help forces can come in.
Sometimes
and then the force can be with us.
Obi
Kenobi said about Luke Skywalker, yes, and now the force is with him.
And it is. Now that I think about it, the term grace is very important here, because it does seem to be a kind of, a miraculous form of grace that engineers this transformation that some people go through. I met one person who I interviewed, who I became friendly with, a Scottish woman who was a heroin addict for about 20 years. And she basically lost everything in her life. She became homeless in the end. She was living on the streets in Edinburgh. And she tried to give up drugs, but couldn't. So she kind of, in the end, she gave up giving up. She thought it was impossible. And in the end, she felt that she had no alternative but to kill herself. So she attempted suicide. But in that moment, when fortunately, she didn't die. But in that moment, something changed inside her. She sort of let go of something. And it was as if a new self emerged inside her. And she said that once she'd sort of got through the withdrawal symptoms, she was free. She had no desire to take drugs ever again. The craving for drugs had just spontaneously, miraculously disappeared. And then she told the story about looking at herself in the mirror, and she didn't recognize herself. She thought, who is that person? I don't know that person. Because she felt so different inside. She didn't recognize her previous normal self. And from that point on, she was a completely different person, and still is 20 years later, as it is now. She's never felt the desire to take drugs or drink again.
Well, we get caught in these identities, don't we, Steve?
Yeah.
And, and so many of us are caught in our socialized identity. And we believe that who we are the images we have of ourselves. Like, I can say, well, I'm a suntanned, nice kind of chap who is blah, 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 but my ideas about myself are not who I really am. And so it's something to do with letting go our ideas about who we think we are. And when we can do that, that's grace. And sometimes it can only happen in a very difficult way. I'll tell you, just a small thing with me. I had sort of treatment for leukemia a few years ago. And the medication I had was really tough. And it really sort of got me to get into meditation more in order to feel a connection with sort of nature. And suddenly I began to have a much stronger connection with sort of nature and trees than I'd ever had before. Wow. And at the same time, another interesting thing happened. My vanity and my ego was really caught in the idea of being really fit. I've kind of prided myself, on having stayed fit all my life. I've done a lot of sport, and suddenly I didn't feel well enough to do any sport, and my kind of muscular body, it all kind of faded away. And so I had to sort of see how identified I was with Serge, with, strong and, and going for runs with his dog. And suddenly, I was this little sort of weaselly little person. And then I saw how much of my identity was in that sense of how I felt I looked. Yes. Yeah. So grace sort of took that away. Yeah. I am happy to say that a little bit of my muscle has come back, Steve.
Well, that's good. That's
just good. A little bit,
Yeah, that's good. It kind of exemplifies that as human beings, we're conditioned into the idea that happiness comes from accumulating things, like accumulating a good body or accumulating possessions. We associate happiness with achievements and success. But often real happiness comes from letting go of those things. I always think that the more you depend on external things like possessions or your appearance,
Yeah.
or your success or achievements, or even your beliefs, the more you depend on those external things, the less access you have to an internal well-being. And sometimes when those things disappear or when you let go of them, that's when you do get access to the inner well-being.
But sometimes we're so attached to these things that we need the universe to intervene fiercely to force us to let go, i.e., there has to be a financial crisis. I mean, do you
Yeah.
remember in the 1928 financial crisis?
1928.
No, sort of. When was that big, the Wall Street crash?
Oh, yeah. I don't remember that.
Sort of 1920 or something. I mean, sort of hundreds of stockbrokers and CEOs began jumping out of their skyscraper sort of windows
Right.
because that they didn't have any money, and so their huge identities sort of faded. So
Yeah.
so aren't we talking about, Steve, that at one level, I like to talk about becoming more fully human as opposed to becoming more spiritual, because spiritual sort of, it kind of has sort of kind of funny connotations that you've got to meditate every day and you have to be vegetarian and stand on your head for half an hour in the morning and then you're spiritual. I like to say kind of be more fully human, because that's what's needed. In fact, that's what's lacking in the world, our humanity, Steve. There's far too many people who have far too much power and far too little humanity.
I agree. I mean, the term spiritual, a lot of people associate it automatically with religion. And I think, spirituality essentially is nothing to do with religion. It can overlap to some degree.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with spiritual traditions or spiritual practices. I've met a lot of people who are very spiritual and they don't know anything about spirituality. They've never meditated. So I mean, I guess that begs the question: what is, what does spirituality or being spiritual mean? To me, it means connection, like connection to others, connection to nature, connection to a deeper part of your being. It means transcending separation, expanding awareness.
Well, Steve, you wrote a book about disconnection, a very, very interesting book. And, and there your thesis was that what's wrong with people, what's wrong with humanity is that we're disconnected from ourselves. We're disconnected from who we are. And you suggested that some people were mega disconnected. Do you want to say a bit about that? Because it's very interesting, your thesis, Steve.
Yeah. I have a model. In fact, the book was based on a model that I call the continuum of connection. So you have on one side of the continuum, you have people who are, I call them hyper disconnected. They're so disconnected that they have no empathy whatsoever. They have no emotional connection or no capacity for emotional connection or love with others. They are completely self-absorbed, completely self-immersed. All that matters to them is the fulfillment of their own needs and desires and ambitions. And if you want to talk about these people in psychological or psychiatric terms, people call them narcissists or psychopaths, sociopaths. And they are the worst human beings. Most of what we call evil behavior flows from these people. On the one hand, they have no empathy, so they have no qualms about hurting others or exploiting others. And the other thing is that because they are so disconnected, they feel a tremendous sense of lack or incompleteness. So they're continually wanting more power, more wealth, in order to compensate for their sense of incompleteness. They have this continual desire to add things to themselves. And usually that means adding more power and more wealth. And unfortunately, they tend to rise into positions of power in our societies.
Well, Steve, I was just thinking, three good examples are Netanyahu, sort of Putin, and a certain person in America who has a rather orange complexion.
I don't know who you mean.
I know you don't. I know, but the interesting thing about all these mega sort of disconnects is that they're very militaristic. You know that they have a lot of violence in them as well.
Yeah.
I mean, sort of look at what is happening sort of with Ukraine, sort of look at what's happening with the Palestinians in Gaza.
Mm.
And so you're talking about the the psychopaths who are mega disconnected, but you were also talking about the ordinary disconnection of the person in the street. Do you
Yeah.
mean by that, Steve, a person who's not connected to their own essence, but
Well,
they just live in their inauthenticity as their
yeah,
personality?
it means a number of different things. Most people are not as disconnected as psychopaths or
Yeah.
narcissists.
Mm-hmm.
And most people are not as connected as spiritually developed people and so-called enlightened or awakened people. They're at the other end of the continuum of
Mm-hmm.
connection. They are people who feel a tremendous sense of empathy, compassion, and altruism,
Yeah.
and so forth. Most people are kind of somewhere in the middle, and it does mean on the one hand that you're not connected to your essential self. You are caught up in an egoic, a kind of superficial egoic mode of identity. But it also means that you're not strongly connected to nature, to the cosmos, and also to other living beings. There's a basic sense of separateness, which I think is common to most human beings. You know, we feel that we are separate entities living inside our minds and bodies in separation from the world. And I believe that most of what we call human suffering arises from that sense of separation or disconnection.
Could I just jump in a second and say
Mm-hmm.
something about the ego? Because I think a lot of people associate ego with disconnect, and that the idea of being spiritual is to be egoless. Well, I
Mm.
don't agree. Um,
Neither do I.
a Jungian analyst suggested that Charles Manson, who did all those murders, do you remember in the
Mm-hmm.
60s,
Mm-hmm.
that the problem with him was he didn't have enough ego, so he had
Really?
no scaffolding. His ego was not strong enough, so he didn't have enough scaffolding to hold
Oh.
his impulses.
Oh.
So so I think that the problem is the unhealthy ego, where our
Mm.
ego
Mm.
is either too small or too big. But
Yeah.
but a lot of gurus say, oh, you have to be egoless and then you'll be spiritual. I don't want to be egoless, Steve,
No.
because my ego does certain things for me. But what is important is that I hope I'm not led by my ego. I hope my ego is my servant more than my
Yeah.
master. And
That,
Jesus said to the devil, he didn't say, hey, buddy, get lost. He said, get thee behind me, Satan.
mm,
So
mm.
we need to have an ego because it allows us to function certain things in the world,
Yeah, I
but not to
agree.
have it
Yeah.
kind of run, rule the roost.
I completely agree. I think that's a bit of a misunderstanding that some people have about spirituality.
Yeah,
And I think, if you want to talk about not having an ego, it's actually a form of psychosis. I think the characteristic of psychosis is to have no sense of control of a
exactly.
controlling ego,
Like Charles
no coherent
Manson,
sense of identity.
like Charles Manson did not have a secure
I
sense of
guess.
identity.
But I think what some people maybe misunderstand is that to have an ego or a sense of identity doesn't necessarily entail that you are separate. You can have a sense of identity and feel completely at one with the universe. You can have a sense of ego and feel attuned to other human beings and to the whole
Yeah.
cosmos. They're not mutually exclusive. And I agree that to live effectively, in this world, obviously we need some sense of identity. Obviously, we need some sense, some ability to organize our lives, to concentrate, some self-control. So yeah, I completely agree. But maybe one interesting aspect about this is that disconnected people, or the kind of hyper disconnected people that we've been talking about in
Yeah.
connection with politics, they can also actually become involved in spirituality. I think
Ah,
at the moment there is,
say more. That's interesting.
well, there always has been an issue in spiritual movements and spiritual
Ah,
communities
yes.
about disconnected teachers, people
Ah,
who present themselves as enlightened and maybe believe that they are enlightened, or maybe they were at one point enlightened, but they are actually quite malevolent and disconnected, narcissistic, even psychopathic. Would you
so
agree?
could we say I see those people as being enlightened in their mind, but not enlightened in their soul or their body or their feelings. So they know about truth, but they
Mm.
don't live that truth. And it's very interesting that we see a lot of cult leaders who are like that. I mean, Jack Kornfeld um, in the 80s, he wrote a paper, the Buddhist teacher, Jack Kornfeld, he's a
Mm-hmm.
psychotherapist
Yeah,
and
I
sort
know.
of Buddhist teacher, and he's written a lot of excellent books. He
Mm.
wrote a paper on the dark side of spiritual sort of masters, and he did a survey of the sort of top 20, hit parade of the sort of gurus that were most in vogue at the time. And he discovered that about 70% of them were more sexually deviant than humanity as a whole.
Mm.
And I
Mm.
think it's something to do sort of with the fact that there's certain temptations in the world. And I think two of the big temptations that both draw some people to be gurus and can pull them down is the lure of money and power.
Mm.
Like, I'm going to, talk about him now because he's dead and he helped a lot of people. And I have certain friends whom he helped a lot. But Rajneesh or Osho
Oh yeah.
was absolutely an example of someone who, for me, was enlightened in his head. He gave wonderful talks. He wrote wonderful books. In fact, I've got two of his books here that have been incredibly useful to me.
Oh yeah.
And,
Mm-hmm.
and I really respect him as, as someone who has helped a lot of people. But
Mm.
somehow in his own life, he never grew up and was completely narcissistic. And as someone said about him, because he didn't know how to relate intimately to anyone, he had to create a situation of everyone bowing down in front of
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
And so, and his driving all those Rolls Royces to show that money was not important. It's just abundance.
Mm. Mm.
And I had a girlfriend who was in the inner circle of what happened around Osho, and his sexual deviancy was very extreme. I'll
Mm.
just say that. But it's
Right.
interesting that that can coexist with a
Yeah.
person who did help a lot of people, and he
Yeah.
some fantastic techniques.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a couple of his books, and they are very clear, very wise and intelligent. I also felt the same about another teacher who is now deceased, Andrew Cohen. Did you come across
Oh,
him?
oh, is Andrew Cohen dead?
Yeah, he died 2 or 3 years ago,
But he wasn't very old, was he?
probably mid 60s, I think. No, so not very old. But I read some of his books. I used to get a magazine that he edited called What is Enlightenment?
Yes, and so did I.
Yeah, it was
And
great.
with Ken Wilber.
That's right. Ken Wilber. I remember Eckhart Tolle was interviewed. They interviewed all of the major spiritual authors and teachers. It was a great magazine. And I used to read his articles, Andrew's own articles and his editorials.
And
And
so
they were
did
very
I.
wise, very intelligent. I read a couple of his books. I thought, wow, yeah, this guy sounds great. Then I went to one of his talks. He came to England a couple of times, maybe more than that, to do talks. But I was disappointed. I thought, wow, this guy sounds sounds kind of petulant. He doesn't sound enlightened to me. There was something a bit kind of dismissive and narcissistic about him. I actually remember asking a question at the end of his talk. I remember putting my hand up and I said, Andrew, a lot of people believe that there is a collective spiritual awakening taking place now. What do you think? And he said, I think that's complete nonsense. And that was all he said. I thought, wow, this doesn't seem like an enlightened guy. And then slowly I heard stories from members of his community. And then a lot of members of his community came out and said that he was abusive and sometimes physically violent, sometimes financially abusive, extorting money from people.
I
And
had
it makes
one of
sense.
his I had one of his people come to me who sort of needed deprogramming because he'd been so abused by Andrew
Really.
Cohen.
Hmm. Hmm.
So sort of what is this sort of mystery that highly intelligent people somehow have something about them, a je ne sais quoi. What's that je ne sais quoi? I ask you as
Well,
a psychologist that somehow that they can create situations for themselves where they seem to have this power over
well,
others.
I think in many cases, they are actually extremely disconnected people to begin with. They have very strong narcissistic traits to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it, being a spiritual teacher is the perfect role for a narcissist or even a psychopath because you get unquestioning devotion from a number of people.
And
You,
girls love you,
yeah,
and you can get all the girls you want.
if you want to,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, if you know, sort of that's your,
Yeah, and I'm
or
sure
in
many
some
people.
cases, all the boys, and there's,
Yeah,
you know,
but yeah,
yeah,
certainly many spiritual teachers have taken advantage of that and exploited
yeah.
that. But I think, as I say, you could choose to become a politician if you are extremely disconnected, or you can choose to be an HEO or a corporate executive, or you can choose to be a spiritual teacher. They're all perfect roles for that personality. And also, I think one thing about these people is that they project certainty. They have no
Interesting.
conscience. They lack human emotions and human inhibitions like self-doubt and guilt or conscience or anxiety. So they project supreme confidence and certainty.
Like
And that's
Trump,
very attractive.
like Trump. I am your retribution, he said.
Really.
Steve, so the question we're sort of getting onto is this: what is it about our society that these kinds of people are encouraged or able to come into positions of power? Why is it that we want people to project certainty? Why? I
Yeah.
mean, I mean, again, the Trump phenomena, because he's a sort of guru, a kind of malevolent guru in a way, but he projects this certainty, his physical size, his boorishness,
Hmm.
his apparent enormous wealth. And so therefore it's very attractive.
Yeah. And
And
also, I think it's very important that these people lack human emotions. And people misinterpret that. They interpret that as strength. Like these people appear
yeah, yeah.
decisive. They are actually very impulsive, but people interpret that as being decisive, and they lack inhibition, and people interpret that as courage. They don't feel anxiety for some reason. They lack these emotions, so people interpret that as strength. I mean,
I
this is a
mean,
problem in spiritual circles, isn't it? It's not just the gurus who
can I just say one thing sort of
yeah.
quickly? When Trump said, I'm going to bomb, I'm going to take Iran back to the Stone Ages, a lot of his MAGA people said, we have a man who shows great strength and
Hmm.
courage and determination.
Yeah. So again, they misinterpret cruelty as a form of strength, don't they?
Yeah,
They
exactly,
mis
exactly.
they misinterpret a lack of empathy as some kind of strength.
Yeah,
Hmm. Well, what do
yeah.
you think? Why do you think that these people appeal to large numbers of
Okay,
others?
okay. Here is a psychological explanation. I think society has a soul wound where so we're a soulless society, and so instead of sort of wanting sort of goodness and beauty and huge sort of opulence of kindness and inner abundance, instead we project soulfulness onto soulless human beings, so
Hmm.
sort of trump, so that the MAGA people, I know I'm going to be attacked for this, but I'm going to say it, but the MAGA people have an issue with soul. And so in the soullessness, Trump has soul projected on them. In other words, what is desacralized becomes sacralized if you don't have soul.
Hmm. Interesting.
I mean,
Yeah.
sort of, have I explained that
Yeah, no,
clearly?
that's it's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that is probably the case. There is another way of looking at it. I mean, if you think about spiritual groups,
Yeah,
and it's not just the spiritual teachers themselves who are to blame for this kind of syndrome, it's also the followers who unconditionally worship these people. They actually inflate their egos even, to an even larger degree because they offer them unconditional devotion and they explain away all their abusive or cruel behavior. All of their selfishness is explained away. Even if they take drugs or get drunk, that's explained away. You know,
yes,
I,
Adi Darfri John or Adi Dar.
yeah, that's
In
right.
his crazy wisdom tradition, sort of people would come to Adi Dar, a couple would come, and if the wife was very attractive, Adi Dar would say, "You need to learn disidentification. I'm going to sleep for 3 days with your wife, and it will be a good training for you in
Mm,
letting go."
yeah,
And so, of course, the person would sort of go along with this, but it was tremendously abusive. And
yes,
again, Adi Dar wrote really good stuff.
that's true. That's true. Ken Wilber was a big admirer of Adidar, wasn't he?
Yes.
And yeah, his books are great, very, very clear. But yeah, I mean, everything is explained away as some kind of test or some kind of divine challenge or divine play. I met a follower of Osho and I said, what about these 93 Rolls Royces? How can you just justify that? And she said, well, actually, he was making a satirical point about Western consumerism, which is one way of looking at it. And there was Chogyam Trungpa. He was also very controversial, wasn't I think he was basically an alcoholic, but his followers would say, he's in his enlightened state. There is no intoxication. He's beyond intoxication, or he's beyond morality. He can be as cruel as he likes because he's in a state that's beyond morality. So it's this kind of like unconditional worship, and this almost like people are hypnotized by these gurus.
Well, Steve, we're talking about the bad eggs. There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of good eggs.
That's true. That's
And
true.
and and I say that for myself, I've always been drawn by teachers who have a kind of humility and a gentleness and don't pretend to be special.
Yeah.
And I'm lucky to have had a couple of those teachers come into my life who were very ordinary human beings, and they had a great sweetness and humility about them. And I was also, I would go to Pune and see Punjaji or Papaji, and he, for me, was a lovely man.
Yeah.
And one evening, um, I stayed late with him and a few other people, and we all watched cricket on his black and white sort of rickety television. And and there was a real sweetness about him.
Yeah.
And so that there are sort of teachers who have a great sweetness and who don't get pushed into that.
That's true. Who were the others, if you don't mind mentioning them?
Well, I hold Ram Dass in great reverence.
Hmm.
And sort of Ram Dass was the one who engineered the saying fierce grace.
Ah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
For for 10 years I was around Ram Dass a lot. And
Right.
he had a lot of sweetness and humility and
Mm.
grace. And then he had this stroke at the height of his powers, you know, and he told the story of how he got to see how much he was getting off with being a successful spiritual teacher, and being asked to give talks and being paid a lot of money, and being invited by people to go scuba diving with them, you know and then you saw that his ego was sort of grabbing hold of it. And
Mm.
now that he couldn't move around, he had to go more deeply into himself. And I think that he became an even greater teacher then. The
Yeah,
interesting
beautiful.
thing,
Beautiful.
Steve, what we're really talking about is that, and Jung talked about it, and he called it the Christ complex, is that
Mm.
the ego can grab hold of certain spiritual understandings. This happened to me in my early 20s. I was doing a form of yoga called Kriya Yoga, which was much too advanced for me. But I was suddenly doing these exercises, and everything became light, and I found this tremendous spiritual light inside me. And for about 2 weeks, I thought I was some extraordinary sort of human being come to save the world. And I was working as a publisher, Steve, and I'd been assigned to work on the novel of a very well-known writer who subsequently, became very, very famous. And in one session, I told him that your book is absolutely useless. It's not spiritual enough. And I mean, of course, the young man, he's now my age, was incredibly insulted. And I'm happy to say, apart from having been taken off as his editor, I bumped into him 30 years later at Victoria Station.
Oh, really?
Apologized to him, and he remembered that incident.
Really?
But that's the example. My ego was not formed properly.
Mm.
And I was
Yeah.
having these experiences, and my ego grabbed them and said, Serge is some
Yeah.
wonderful person. I have come to save the world. And
Mm.
that's the interesting thing.
That
So
can
that's why
happen.
we
Yeah.
need to have a disciplined ego.
Yeah. I think that's the reason some gurus become corrupted. I think maybe that happened to Adi Dar because if you have a sort of a glimpse of awakening and you're not ready for it or you're not well developed in other areas, it can really inflate your ego. And you can think, wow, I've seen the truth. I need to spread this truth to other people. Maybe I'm enlightened. If you have a tendency towards narcissism, it can really inflate that tendency and take you off into, that Christ complex that you described.
Steve, you have done huge research. What do you mean by awakened and enlightenment? Because you've done a huge amount of research in this area.
Mm.
And and I think that we need to get beyond the point of thinking that we're only okay if we're enlightened or awakened. I mean, I
Yeah.
can say about myself that I don't feel in the slightest bit enlightened or
Well,
awakened, and I don't know if that's because my ego isn't grabbing hold of anything. but I just feel a very ordinary person who's interested
Well,
in these things. But you've done research
well,
in this. So sort of talk about it, Steve, because it's very
hmm.
interesting. You're a
Well, I
great
have
expert in
maybe I
this
have a different
area.
conception to other spiritual authors because I see enlightenment as a continuum. I actually don't like using the term enlightenment because it's very rarefied.
Yeah.
It suggests something unattainable. So I like using the term awakening or wakefulness. And I think it's much more common than most people realize. And it is a question of degrees. It's not either or. A lot of people think that, oh yeah, there's this state of enlightenment in which you become a completely different person and all of your problems are solved and you feel completely at bliss and at one and at peace. But there's a big, there's a big continuum. There are lots of degrees of awakening. So I think you can talk about it in terms of different characteristics. And one characteristic is you get, well, there are, in my research, I actually identified 16 major characteristics of awakening. And one characteristic is a heightened perception, so that the world around you looks more real and more beautiful. Another characteristic is a sense of gratitude. You don't take things for granted. You're aware of the value of certain aspects of your life. Also, that you have a sense of disidentification from your mind, so that you don't necessarily have a quiet mind. You can still think, but you're aware that you are not your thoughts. There's a certain space between you and your thoughts. You also feel a strong sense of empathy towards other human beings and other living beings. So I think you can talk about it in terms of those characteristics, 16 altogether. And obviously those characteristics can vary in intensity. And the more intense they are, the more awakened you are. But so it's not something esoteric, it's not something unattainable. It's something that a lot of human beings possess to some degree, even if they're not, what we would call enlightened. They are awakened
Well,
to some
well,
degree.
I mean, one has this image that the enlightened person sort of walks around, sort of feeling one with everything. Yes, I mean, I'm in this room, but I'm one with this picture. I'm one with. Well, look, I've got a person who is pretty awake, who's just here, and I'm going to introduce him. Because here's a
Oh,
person.
he's
Here's a
enlightened.
person who's
Hello.
who sort of knows how to flow with it and sort of
Oh,
does his.
he's definitely enlightened. What's his
But
name?
crumble,
Crumble.
as in apple,
Right.
as in apple. Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think I was going to say, when you were talking about your spiritual teachers just before, I was going to mention my spiritual teacher because I've only really had one spiritual teacher, and he was my teacher for maybe 20 years or so. And he was a guy called Russell Williams,
Yeah.
based here in Manchester, England. And he was a very, very ordinary, very humble man. In fact, when I first met him, I was probably 29 at the time. And I still had this image that to be enlightened, you had to somehow wear a robe and have a long beard, and you had to live in a state of bliss and a state of
Yeah.
complete oneness with everything. But he wasn't like that. He wore a suit and tie. He looked like a very normal 70-year-old guy, as he was at the time. And he even talked quite normally. He had quite a strong kind of working class type accent. And he talked about normal things. He talked about the price of food, and he talked about television programs. And I thought, wow, why do people think this guy is enlightened? But as I spent time with him, I realized that he had a very powerful radiance, which would fill me with a sense of well-being. And I felt great for days afterwards after meeting him. And then I realized that he was extremely wise, and he did experience a sense of oneness with other beings and other people. And he was extremely benevolent, but he never tried to draw attention to himself. And he never actually tried to write a book. I persuaded him to write a book, and I helped him to write a book. But he was always reluctant because he never wanted to get too much attention. He was always happy just working with a small group of people, helping a small group of people to become awakened.
He's an example of what one refers to as the hidden sage.
Mm. Yeah. I think a lot of people, a lot of the most awakened people, have probably passed away unknown because they didn't draw attention to themselves.
Yeah.
Although at the same time, if you are awakened to some degree, you do feel a sense of mission or a desire to help people, a desire to help the human race, as a whole, in some sense. And that can mean becoming a teacher in some way.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, Steve. I mean, just talking about myself, I've always felt a mission to help the human race and to help people. You know, that's why I've spent the last 50 years teaching spiritual retreats and seeing people as clients and sort of, and more recently following your example, sort of writing a few books. But the whole idea of me being in any way enlightened, I really don't sort of hold that. I see myself as a decent bloke, and it feels better to see myself in that way. I'm
Yeah,
quite a
yeah.
kind person. I mean, I don't sort of steal, and I don't sort of, I sometimes lose my temper.
Hmm.
Sort of with my daughter once I lost my temper because, but
Well, that's
yeah,
that, that's human. Um, I
ah,
think maybe,
but human. And we say, but he's only human. So therefore, that one can get away with anything, implying that being human means that, that we can tell lies and fuck around. Oh, well, he's only being human. And
yeah.
sort of Epstein, I heard
Hmm.
someone say about him, well, he just loves the young girls. He's only human, sort
Yeah,
of
they
what
say
else
that
does
about
one.
this. They sometimes say that about right-wing politicians. Oh, he's just an ordinary working-class guy. Of course, he's racist and sexist. It's a terrible excuse. And most working-class guys are not like that anyway. It's an insult to working-class guys. And it's an insult to humans to say that these people are only being human.
By the way, I just heard that song by John Lennon, A Working Class Hero. What a
Mm.
fantastic song. I mean, I just happened to hear it again the other day. I
Yeah,
hadn't heard it for years. What an
great song.
incredible song.
Yeah, I love that verse when he says, "They keep you doped with religion and sex and TV. You think you're so clever, so classless and free, but you're still fucking peasants as far as I can see." That's so, it's so angry, but in a way, very possibly true as well. But I mean, that's from an album which he wrote after his primal scream therapy. And it's a really,
Oh, with Yanov, that's right.
yeah, the whole album is kind of imbued with this kind of trauma and in his attempts to exercise his trauma. It's a really powerful, moving album. There's a song called Mother when he writes about his childhood where his mum leaves him and his father leaves him.
Mother.
Yeah,
Yes.
you left me, but I never left you. I wanted you. You didn't want me. It's so simple, but so powerful and it's so sad.
I am so impressed, Steve, that you've just written a book about the Beatles and it about their creativity.
Mm.
And I think it'll be coming out soon. Yeah.
In September, yeah, in about
Wow.
where are we now? We're in June, so yeah, three or 4 months in September.
Do you feel that they had something enlightened about them?
Definitely, I feel that they were conduits. They were channels of something transcendent, and in their early songs, that comes out in the kind of the positive energy of their music. It's tremendously exciting and positive. But in their sort of mid career, when they were interested in psychedelics and spirituality, it came out in a more obviously spiritual way. So a lot of their songs are imbued with spiritual elements, like Across the Universe, Let It Be, and many others. So I think they were opening themselves to something transcendent, to spiritual impulses. And in some ways they were, they were expressing the zeitgeist as well. I mean, there was a lot of conscious expansion at that time. There seemed to be a collective opening of consciousness. A lot of people were interested in spirituality and psychedelics.
But it's interesting. I read a book about John Lennon, and apparently in the last few years of his life, he kind of sort of withered away as a man with sort of Yoko Ono and his other sort of Chinese lover that he had. And apparently, I mean, I read it in this book. I mean, it may not be the truth, but the reason why he died when he was shot was because his body had no muscle in it. Sort of muscle is very important for our strength, for all the other system. And apparently that his body couldn't take the impact because all the other systems had slowed down because there was no sort of muscle mass, because he'd
possibly
spent the last
I don't know.
4
I heard
years
something
in bed taking drugs.
I'm not sure. I read that he actually cleaned up in the last few years of his life. There was a guy called. Have you ever heard of a TV program called Everybody Loves Raymond?
No.
No, it's a famous American comedy show, and there's an actor in it. I can't remember his name now, John somebody, but he was actually a friend of John Lennon's in the last 5 years of John Lennon's life. John Lennon was the best man at his wedding, and he said that he was so close to John because they were both spiritual seekers. They were both seeking enlightenment. This guy was an ex-Christian monk, this actor. So I think, I heard another person told me that John Lennon used to visit the TM Center in Manhattan in the late 70s. So I think maybe there's another story there that he did become, and I think he definitely cleaned up in the last 5 years of his life, and maybe he did turn towards spirituality again.
But sort of what it does show is that people with a very strong spiritual awakening impulse are often also very vulnerable human beings in other areas. And so sort of I think that the more sensitive one is, the more susceptible one can be to being pulled down or being
I think so.
I mean, a thing that I found sort of interesting, I don't know if you agree, is that however high and evolved we are, that the dark forces, whatever we want to call them, can sort of reach up and pull us down. And by the same token, however in the darkness, in the dark night of the soul, sort of we are, however lost and desperate, the forces of light can also reach down and pull us up.
That's a beautiful way of looking at it, Serge. Yeah, that's beautiful.
I mean, sort of people who've been very lost and desperate have, talked about, yes, a sort of rescuing force coming in, sort of, which is what we talked about at the beginning of our talk, Steve, about, about fierce grace.
Yeah, I think if you have a strong ego, if your ego boundaries are solid and strong, it can make life quite easy. You're kind of shielded against too much negativity. You don't really feel other people's sufferings. You're not really aware of world problems. You're not really worried about the human race as a whole. You're kind of enclosed within your ego, and you feel quite confident and have a strong sense of identity. But it's when your ego is soft, when your ego opens up, that's when you become open to spiritual experiences.
Well, is it the ego opening up, or is it something else opening up?
Well, I'd say it's the ego boundaries opening.
The ego boundaries,
yeah. I mean, that goes back to what we were saying earlier. You need a sense of ego.
Yeah.
But you don't need ego boundaries. You don't need to have strong and solid ego boundaries, because they separate you from the world and separate you from others. But on the one, it makes life easier in some ways because you defend yourself against all that negativity. You don't get overwhelmed by experience or overwhelmed by situations. You feel confident and strong. Yeah. But it's, it's a poison chalice because it does separate you from your deep spiritual self. It separates you from creativity too. You know, to be creative, you've got to have soft ego boundaries.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
Serge,
Well, Steve, this seems a good
yeah,
time to go our ways, and I just want to say that either next week or the week after, we're going to be sort of talking with a very interesting man who's become a good friend of ours called Philip
Philip Cargom.
God, I always forget. And, and Philip Cargom, who's written hundreds of books on, and he's like Steve on all sorts of different subjects. Um,
Mm,
and 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 he used to be head of the Druids.
that's right.
And he's a
Yeah,
very, very, very interesting
very
man.
interesting
And
guy.
so,
Mm,
and he'll either be sort of coming on sort of next week or the week after,
yeah.
depending on his availability.
Okay. Yeah,
Good.
that's right. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
Yeah,
And
good.
would you like to say something profound to end our podcast?
Whoa. Uh,
I'm putting you under
the,
pressure now.
uh, the answer lies in the soil.
The answer
So,
lies in the soil.
sort of, who was it that said that? There was
I've never
some
heard that
guy.
before.
There was some guy. Yeah, Steve, you weren't sort of alive in those days when those yes, there was this person on English television. He'd always say, "Oh yes, the answer lies in the
Oh, is it? It
soil."
wasn't David Bellamy, was it? It sounds like David Bellamy. Anyway,
Could have been. It
but it
could have
sounds
been.
profound, anyway. The answer lies in the soil. Mm.
Yes.
But did he mean the soul? The answer lies in the soul.
Well, no, I think it was soil. But then Satish Kumar wrote a very good book called Soul and Soil,
Ah,
of
yeah.
the connection
Yeah,
between.
it is interesting that soil and soul
But
are so close
actually, the
together.
thing that I would just like to end by saying is that for me personally, and it's the thing that when I teach my retreats, we all work out of doors. I think that soul can be most found outdoors in
Mm.
nature, in experiencing the beauty of nature. And
Yeah, I
I
agree.
think that the more that we can connect ourselves to nature and sort of feel into the earth and the air and the fire and the water of nature and fill ourselves with it, I think
I
it's very,
agree.
very important.
I completely agree. Yeah. That's why so many poets write about nature. That's why so many mystical experiences occur in nature.
Yes,
Mm.
yes, I love Wordsworth, the
Yeah.
intimations of immortality.
That's right. And it's interesting that we talk about being grounded, and mystics talk about the ground of being
The
or the
ground
ground
of
of the
being,
soul.
the deeper ground of being. We need to be grounded. And I
Mm,
think,
mm.
I also sort of will say this sort of spirituality is often associated with airy fairiness. We need to be grounded. We need to be solid. We
Mm.
need to be earth based because
Yeah.
often, unless our feet are walking on the earth, um, there's a wonderful quote um, by that great existentialist, and I can't remember, Walt Whitman, and
Oh,
I've
yeah.
lost it. I tell you, a thing of getting older, Steve. I forget, I forget facts. Anyway,
Right.
we say goodbye to
Yeah.
you all,
Yeah.
and we hope you've enjoyed our little discussion, and we welcome you to many more of them. Okay.
That's right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Serge. Beautiful
Thank you,
talking with
Steve.
you.
Yep.
All the
Great.
best, everybody.
All the best.